Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is a presentation in one of the sessions for the virtual conference of the North Carolina Maritime History Council in 2020. I'd like to thank the Council for allowing me to present. My name is Dr. Nathan Richards. I am a professor in the Department of History at East Carolina University and also the Director of the Program in Maritime Studies. Today I'm going to present an interim report on what we call the Waterlily Shipwreck timbers. And this is a collection of relatively small timbers, small collection of timbers that have come out of Currituck Sound in around 2014. And I'll just talk about the circumstances of discovery and what we're doing to the timbers and sort of where we sit with research today as we continue to work and examine and study the timbers. Now, these timbers were first discovered in around February of 2014. In February of 2014, a winter storm ripped through Currituck Sound, coming from Virginia, moving south across Currituck Sound, and in the process of doing that, sucked a lot of the water out of the Sound and exposed a lot of the bottomlands of the Sound. In the process of doing that, there was a collection of timbers along Waterlily Road that were discovered by a local resident. This resident had a boat launch and retrieval area and for a long time knew that there was an obstacle there, an obstacle that was an impediment to launching and retrieving their boat. And so that individual was able to go into the water and remove a lot of the timbers and take them to the Currituck dump to dispose of them. One of his neighbors, a woman by the name of Debbie Pless, lived a few doors away, and she had previously seen a presentation given by myself about the Currituck wreck, which was a wreck that washed up on Currituck Beach on the ocean side of Currituck County in 2010. And there were sort of two things that she took away from that presentation. That the first one was that the Currituck wreck was extensively trunneled. The fasteners that we used to construct that wreck were predominantly wooden nails, or what we call trunnels. The second part of the takeaway for her was that archaeological timber coming out of a wet environment that's allowed to dry will distort and will lose a lot of important archaeological information. So when she saw her neighbor taking these timbers to the dump that looked a lot like the Currituck timbers, she asked if she could take possession of the remaining timbers that he hadn't taken to dispose of. That was about 18 timbers. And so the neighbor consented to that. She was able to carry those timbers a short distance, and she had a small fiberglass skiff that she filled up with water, and she placed the timbers in that skiff. Soon afterwards, she contacted me. So her intention was to have an archaeologist look at the timbers or to tell her more about them. So around the 21st of March in 2014, she contacted me while I was working for the UNC Coastal Studies Institute in Wanchese on Roanoke Island. And soon after, I went out to visit her and made a short report on what we thought the timbers were. So I'd been in communication with the North Carolina Underwater Archaeology branch to ask their permission to look at these, provided them a report of my findings. Now, while I was there visiting with Debbie Pless, the neighbor, the original discoverer, came across and conveyed the story of the removal, giving some more contextual information. His story was that this site, this sort of obstacle in his boat retrieval area, was probably the bow of a boat or a ship that had washed ashore. It stood about 3 to 4 feet off the bottomlands, off the Currituck Sound bottom, and that had been sitting adjacent to his property for many years. He saw it as a hazard, and so he went into the when he saw the opportunity to remove it, he went and knocked the wooden pegs out of the bow and chainsawed a lot of the timbers in order to take them to the local dump. It's not sure whether the 18 that remained were the had been subjected to chainsaw. There was no apparent chainsaw damage, although there are many places where trunnions are missing from the timbers, and we can assume that perhaps this is how these 18 in particular were dislodged from the main structure. So I made a report to the Underwater Archaeology branch, which is part of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources in the state, and they requested that the timbers be taken into some kind of state custody. In this particular case, the request was whether we at the Coastal Studies Institute and at East Carolina University could find some educational benefit. And so there were kind of two things that were arranged. On the 25th of April, we signed an agreement between the state, the Coastal Studies Institute, and East Carolina University's program in Maritime Studies to do a small number of things. To take the timbers and to store them in retention ponds at the UNC Coastal Studies Institute, in the process of storing, to remove them and to comprehensively photograph and draw them, and then to transition them into a conservation program, and to additionally use them for educational goals. So specifically, I was in charge of comprehensively photographing and drawing the timbers. The Maritime Studies Association was involved in organizing a dendrochronology workshop, and then Dr. Brad Rogers, who was the then director of the program in Maritime Studies, was also going to undertake an experimental conservation treatment program on the timbers using calcium carbonate. During this process, and really after the process is completed, the timbers remain the property of the state of North Carolina, and they do today. So here's some images. On the left-hand side, one of my graduate students, Betty Pratt, taking timbers into the retention pond, the wastewater treatment ponds at the Coastal Studies Institute. In the center, you can see Dr. Jason Raup and myself retrieving them. The timbers at that particular point had been recorded, and then we've transitioned them out to East Carolina University, where they remain in the solution that is hopefully conserving them. I mentioned before that we, as a part of the agreement with the state of North Carolina, a dendrochronology workshop was arranged by the Maritime Studies Association. Dr. Paul Kriesman and Dr. William Wright came out from the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona. This is a workshop organized by Yvonne Malima, who was a graduate student in the program in Maritime Studies at the time. Additionally, it was intended from the beginning that we would run some public education programming with these timbers as the focus. For many years, Dr. Lynn Harris and myself have run NAS, Nautical Archaeology Society, training programs in the state of North Carolina. We ended up running two-part 3 workshops. The first one, a photography workshop, the second one, an illustration workshop. During these workshops, members of the public were able to come out and help go through the process of carefully photographing the timbers and also illustrating them by tracing them onto greenhouse plastic. Not all of the timbers were completed during those training programs though, so we continued to record the timbers with the help of graduate students at the program in Maritime Studies like Nick DeLong and Greg Stratton. They would periodically come out and help do the greenhouse plastic tracing and the photography. So the reason we did all of the photography and the scale drawing is to create a comprehensive catalogue of the timbers for the state and for us to inform future research. Here are 2 examples, 2 particular timbers based upon the photographic information that just lets us record or communicate the diagnostic information from every surface of every timber, and in some cases to actually maybe let us start to understand how the ship is perhaps constructed. So a comprehensive catalogue is really the end goal of the 2-dimensional recording. But with that information and with such detailed information drawn to scale by basically tracing the timbers, we also were able to create 3-dimensional renderings in computer-aided design software. And in this particular image is a screenshot of a Roanoke model that I've created showing the 18 timbers lined up next to each other to scale. To give you a sense of scale, you can see a long plank here that I'll talk about in a minute. That's about 7 meters long. So a very large element of the ship. And this is an interesting piece because it shows us the potential location where frames and futtocks once sinked into what's perhaps outer hull planking on the ship. So after all this recording, what do we have? What parts of the ship do we have? Well, we have 18 timbers. 2 of these timbers are probably plank fragments. In the top right hand corner, you'll see a part of what is perhaps a bottom plank, a fragment of a bottom plank, perhaps with a butt joint at the one end at the right hand side here, where it connected to or was running alongside other bottom planks. And then we have what is probably a side plank. You'll notice the scarf, the evidence of a scarf here. We have one timber that is perhaps a damaged floor. I think it's a damaged floor. You can see the location of an iron spike. I'll talk more about fasteners in a minute. And you'll notice the water course or the limber hole here. So the backbone probably ran across here in some configuration, perhaps a keel or a large bottom plank at the bottom of the ship here, and then this maybe continued to the other side of the ship. There are what appears to be 5 half floors. In addition, these are shorter. There's a shorter distance between the end of the watercourse or the limber to the end of the timber, and there doesn't seem to be any chainsaw damage to the end of the timber here. We do have 8 what appear to be futtocks. These would run up and next to the floors, which ran up to the backbone or the keelson of the ship. What you'll notice in all these timbers is the presence of these in situ trunnels. This is perhaps indication of the thickness of the planking that would have run along the outside of the ship. There are 3 unknown timbers. Now, if the discoverer's story is the correct story, then if this is the bow of the vessel, there could be a range of other timbers that have become dislodged and damaged, but are perhaps part of the stem or the bow of the ship. It will take some theorizing and some playing with the data to work out what they potentially could be. Regarding fasteners, we have extensive use of wooden trunnels. This is just one example photographed on the day that I visited the site originally. The trunnels are, this particular trunnel is 1 inch in diameter, 7 3/4 inches long. It's quite representative of many of the trunnels still in situ in the floors and the futtocks. They are all octagonal in cross section. What we notice is there are 2 types of modifications to these trunnels. In the case of the external plank, the long plank that I showed you before, many trunnels are paired up or in some cases alternate with evidence of an iron fastener, and where it appears to be the outside surface of the plank, we see a peg, an additional wooden peg has been driven into the center of the trunnel to keep it in place. In the cases of the floors and the futtocks, we have extensive use of trunnel wedges that are also driven in a similar fashion into the top sides of the futtocks and frames. There is very little iron. Iron shows up here and there. Most consistently, we see iron spikes, which you see here on the left. You'll see the iron spikes at the center point where the floors or the potential half floors would have been sitting up against or running into and underneath the keelson. We see the use of iron, these larger iron spikes. In the other case, we do have a few cases of wrought iron nails that have been driven into different parts of the timbers, but most often the evidence of ferrous nails is in the case of indentations and iron staining in some parts of the frames. Some timbers, here are two examples from timber 1 and timber 6, appear to have tool markings. They don't appear to sort of be, they appear to be sort of weathered. I can't say with certainty whether they're from the discoverer's dismantling of the site, but there's potential signs of adze marks, axe marks, and maybe even saw marks in some cases. One of the interesting observations of the waterlily timbers is different patterns of burning and charring that we see on different timbers, and there are some distinct patterns. The first is we tend to see some charring at the ends of futtocks. If you could imagine, and perhaps we could theorize that these were the highest parts of the tallest parts of the structure, and that perhaps as the vessel was burning, these were the most likely to burn. The second thing that we see on the plank fragment is a pattern where fire was scorching the plank on the either side of a frame. And this is important diagnostic information because it gives us some sense of the room and space of the vessel, and perhaps a framing pattern that we can follow along the hull if we engage in a reconstruction later. In a few other instances, we see that the entire timber is charred on basically every side of the timber. Another potential interpretation of the waterlily timbers involves considering whether we see errors in construction or repairs. This is an image of the 3D model data. I should note here that in some cases where you see a wedge, this is an in situ trunnel. In other cases, these represent where trunnels would have run, but maybe are just trunnel holes, where trunnels are now missing. In this particular case, we see an area where it appears that two trunnel holes have been augured out next to each other. And it could be that this is an area that was repaired, or it could also be interpreted as perhaps an error in construction. Now, we don't see any evidence of sealing timbers, which would be evidenced by indentations for nails or other fastener patterns on the top of the futtocks and frames. On the underside of some of these timbers, we do see, but only on certain timbers, areas of dense nail indentations. So every now and then, and if you look over here at the second timber number 2, we see some areas where there might be a wrought nail that's had left an indentation in the underside. But in some timbers, it seems like there are many fasteners driven in certain areas and not in others. I'm not sure if it's an error or a repair. Likewise, there is one particular timber that is particularly interesting. It's a small timber. It's the only one that has fasteners running on every surface of the timber. So what we're looking at here is, we assume it's perhaps sitting in the appropriate orientation. This is timber 8. We see, just like the other timbers, the trunnels and the wedges, but on some sides we're seeing the indentations of wrought nails. And then interestingly, in this particular instance, we have the indentations of what appears to be some fastener coming from an adjacent timber, indenting at different angles. So I'm not sure if this is proof of articulation with another timber, or whether it's perhaps a reused timber, or perhaps also evidence of some repair that happened through the ship's life. A final observation is that there's almost no marine growth on these timbers, and this is potentially an interesting diagnostic trait. You'll see up here, this is where waterlily is, and we have a really well-defined geological history of how certain inlets closed over time. In the case of Currituck Sound, it has a well-known history where over time, what was a marine environment that was open to the Atlantic Ocean underwent a series or a cascade of different inlet closures, beginning when old Currituck Inlet closed around 1731, Caffey's Inlet around 1811, and New Currituck Inlet was closed by 1828. And this is well documented in Currituck history, where the environment slowly turned brackish and is basically very fresh now, and changed the ecosystem, and also probably changed the operating environment and the economic scenario for people in Currituck Sound. So perhaps this 1828 date is some clue as to the perhaps the age of the wreck that the Waterlily timbers belong to. Now, what do we know about the area? Well, I'm not going to go into a full history of Currituck Sound or Currituck County. We know that land deeds go back to the 1600s. We know that the first reference to the area that we know as Waterlily is noted on the Cumberford map of 1657, where there's a reference to Emperor's Island. We're not sure why it's called, or I'm not sure why it's called Emperor's Island. On the Ogilby map of 1671, we see the term White's Island used. We know in this period of time we have extant land deeds mentioning White's Island around 1714. In the 1600s and early 1700s, we have family names associated with the island. Names like Jarvis, Sanderson, Taylor, White, unsurprisingly, and Church, which is a name that will become important later. We know that in the early 1700s, land was being deeded from lords proprietors like Lord Carteret to individuals, and we know, for example, that Joseph Church was deeded land in 1714, and the Jarvis family in 1726, and the Church family additional land in 1718 and 19. It's probably no surprise that not long afterwards, by around 1733, we see on the Moseley map White's Island being referred to as Church's Island. During the early period of European settlement, Currituck residents are known to have used shallow draft boats, carrying out all sorts of commerce. We know that many names of Church's Island from this period of time, certain families, the Woodhouse family, the Humphreys family, and the Church family. And this is an image showing Moseley map, Church's Island. This is a different map. This is the John Collett map, 1770. We see in this map different spelling, Church Island. We also see on land deeds Church spelled with an E, or sometimes Church spelled with an E and in the possessive. We know that Waterlily is probably settled around this time. Now, Waterlily is defined in the North Carolina Gazetteer as, quote, a community on the south end of Church Island, East Currituck County, settled around 1750, end quote. And land deed information shows that the Church family is deeding land around 1770 to other families like the Woodhouse family, Etheridge family, Humphreys family, and that some of these individuals are being referred to as merchants. In some cases, their land is being referred to as plantation land, and there's an increasing number of people in the area. So the cartographic information is important in trying to set the historical context to maritime trade in the Sound through time. And we're interested in setting this historical context because we'd like to perhaps assign a function to the Waterlily Shipwreck that the timbers have come from. Now, it's unfortunate that we have much better information about maritime transportation in Currituck Sound in the late 19th century. We know some commentators, for instance, Curtis in 1977, quoted that transportation was strictly by water until about 1900. We know that occupations in the area came to focus upon predominantly on things like farming, duck hunting, fishing, crabbing, and oystering. We know that by early 1900 there was many more families living on Churches Island and in the Waterlily area. But really we don't have a great wealth of information about the vessels trading in the area or the shipwrecks that might have wrecked against Churches Island. So without a definitive newspaper reference or some historical record pointing to the loss of a wreck against Churches Island, we turn to comparative sites. These are the sites that have been recorded by other archaeologists of vessels from the 18th and early 19th century. I should say this is the type of vessel that we believe the Waterlily best compares to by comparing things like length to breadth ratios, and individual timber dimensions. So there's a list of, I think, 13 well-documented sites that we currently have, stretching from North Carolina to Georgia, that we can look at and compare Waterlily to. And there are some interesting observations to come out with. For example, the floor and futtock dimensions of the Waterlily site seem to be very similar to the Browns Ferry wreck dimensions, and also the B&B wreck dimensions, which are two wrecks worked on by Skier in South Carolina. Similarly, sided and molded dimensions of the floors and futtocks on the Waterlily site are very close to Browns Ferry, but also bear resemblance to the B&B site, the Ingram site, and the Mepkin Abbey wreck. And they also share a similarity in the type of fasteners used. These are all wrecks in South Carolina. The one that I'm most interested in right now, though, is the half-floor configuration of our site and comparison with the B&B wreck. And I've included a scan of a page out of a thesis by Harry Pecorelli in 2003 that shows perhaps a comparison to how our half floors would have come in under a keelson. You can see the limber hole here, although our limber holes appear to have been cut and chiseled out rather than augered out, as in the case of the B&B wreck, and would have sat under the keelson. Now, we don't have any evidence that the Waterlily wreck had a keel or a keel shoe or anything like this. It probably was a flatter vessel, or at least that's the interpretation right now. But this gives us some insight to how the frames of the ship would have been configured, and perhaps how the planking was attached and how the whole backbone was configured. Then another next step is, if we can play with these model timbers, we perhaps can come to some understanding of a reconstruction. Now, I should point out here that this is me playing with the timbers. I don't think this is a serious reconstruction at this point in time. There's too much work to be done to better identify where the timbers are. But this is an example where I'd say perhaps we can lead to a reconstruction. Of course, one of the challenges is that there's only 18 timbers. But given that we do have floors and futtocks, we can probably reasonably infer a few things. We can probably infer the breadth of the vessel, and I would say that the breadth of the vessel is bordering upon 14 feet, and that's a guess based upon juxtaposing or bringing into alignment what we think is the half floors and floors, and running futtocks up against them in the same alignment, and making some guesses about the curvature of the hull for a flat bottom vessel. Now, from that, because we have the 13 well-documented sites, we know that these coastal craft along the eastern seaboard often have a beam to length ratio or length to beam ratio of between 2.7 and 3.6 to 1. So if we times that 14 feet of breadth, we get a vessel somewhere in the order of 38 feet to about 50 feet. And we can also perhaps make some reasonable inferences to say that the depth of hold would be about 3 feet or maybe a little bit more. We also have that anecdotal evidence from the discoverer of the wreck that said that the bow sat 3 to 4 feet above the bottom of the sound. So if we do that and we do the basic calculations, we might say that this vessel was perhaps about 17 to 23 tons. But of course, this is all guesswork right now. This is only an interim report and there's more work to be done. Of course, the other next step would be to find these timbers a home. So our hope is that once these timbers are recorded, we've learned everything about them, we've published whatever we can reasonably say about them, that the timbers can hopefully go to a museum, that can hopefully be continued to be enjoyed and maybe studied into the future. Thank you for listening to me. I need to acknowledge the Department of History. The Department of History awarded me a Brewster Research Scholar Award to pursue this research. Thanks to my colleagues there. I also need to make particular reference to the program of Maritime Studies, to a number of colleagues and also a large number of students who have assisted with handling these timbers since 2014. Thanks to my colleagues at the UNC Coastal Studies Institute, also to the NAS program participants, the North Carolina Department of Natural Cultural Resources, and the Underwater Archaeology branch. Thanks especially to Debbie Pless in Waterlily for saving these timbers and to allow us to learn from them. There's still a lot of historical and archaeological research to do. I'd love to hear from people about errors I'm making or about sites to compare to, but otherwise I look forward to answering any questions or hearing your thoughts during the session question and answer period. Thank you.